The Black Talon. Reed read it out loud so the whole room could hear. Then he laughed. Not a small laugh, a real one, loud enough to pull 3 heads up from their work. "Lady, that rifle has a classified designation older than your career." Someone in the back called out, "Tell her to check the museum." The laughter spread fast and ugly. Olivia stood at that counter without moving, without blinking, without giving them a single thing to read. She let every laugh land exactly where it was aimed. Then she said quietly, "Issue me the standard rifle." She picked it up and walked out. Nobody noticed the general standing at the end of the hallway. He had heard everything, and he was already smiling, because they had absolutely no idea what they had just done. If this story already has you hooked, subscribe to the channel right now, and follow every part to the end. And drop a comment below, tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The weapons request form was standard issue 2 pages, carbon copy, standard military formatting. Sergeant Marcus Reed had processed thousands of them. He could scan one in under 10 seconds, stamp it, move on. He was good at his job, and he knew it, and that confidence had a way of bleeding into everything he did, the way he stood behind the counter, the way he barely looked up when soldiers walked in, the way he already had an answer ready before anyone finished asking. So when Captain Olivia Hayes slid the form across the counter that Tuesday morning, Reed picked it up without making eye contact. He was halfway through stamping the first page when something made him stop. He read the line again. Then he set the stamp down. "You serious?" Olivia stood with her hands at her sides, her field bag on her left shoulder, her old rifle case leaning against her right leg. She was not tall. She was not imposing. She wore no unit patch, no campaign ribbons pinned to her chest, no visible markers that told a man like Reed what category to file her in. She looked, to him, like someone who had wandered into the wrong room and didn't know it yet. "Yes," she said. Reed turned the form around and raised it, so the 2 supply officers working behind him could see the line he was pointing at. "She's requesting the Black Talon." The younger of the 2 officers, a specialist named Denny Cho, who'd been stationed at Fort Raven for 8 months, stopped what he was doing and looked up. "She's what?" "Black Talon. Written right here." Reed set the form back down on the counter and looked at Olivia with an expression that wasn't quite amused and wasn't quite hostile. It was something more condescending than either. "Captain, I don't know who told you about that designation, but that's not something we issue." "I understand," Olivia said. "Is it available in inventory?" Reed actually laughed at that. Not a small laugh. A real one, the kind that invites a room to join. "Available in inventory." He said it like she'd asked whether they stocked medieval swords. "No, it is not available in inventory. It's not available anywhere. It's a designation from a program that most people in this building have never heard of, and the few that have heard of it assume it was discontinued." "Assume," Olivia said. Reed paused. "You said assume." Her voice was even. Not corrective, not aggressive, just precise. Not confirmed. The smile on Reed's face changed slightly. The amusement was still there, but something sharper moved underneath it. "Are you correcting me? I'm asking a question." By then, 3 more people had drifted close enough to hear Specialist Cho, another supply officer named Torres, and a young special operations candidate named Ryan Mitchell, who had been in the armory waiting for a maintenance check on his own equipment. Mitchell was 26, ranked 3rd in his qualification cohort, and had never once been outshot by someone who looked the way Olivia looked. He watched the exchange with the particular attention of someone who knows a performance is happening but hasn't yet decided what kind. Reed squared his shoulders. "Here's what I can tell you, Captain. The Black Talon, if it ever existed as anything more than a classified prototype, is not in our active inventory. It is not in our storage. It is not something I can issue, request on your behalf, or pull from any system I have access to. What I can do is issue you standard equipment appropriate to your assignment." "What is your assignment?" "Shadow Ridge Advanced Operations." That got a reaction from Mitchell, who straightened slightly. Reed glanced at him, then back at Olivia. "Shadow Ridge." He said it the way people say the name of a place they've heard is difficult but haven't been to themselves. Right. Okay, what's your specialty? Precision fire. Sniper, Reed said, already reaching for the standard long-range rifle on the rack behind him. Precision fire, Olivia said again. Reed stopped. He looked at her. She held his gaze. He didn't know what the distinction was. He suspected it was semantics, but something in her repetition of the phrase made him hesitate for just a moment before he turned back to the rack. Right, he said. Precision fire. Standard issue long-range platform. You'll qualify on it tomorrow, and I already qualified. Reed turned. You just got here. I qualified on the range this morning. 500. The range officer logged it. Cho leaned over his terminal and typed something. His eyebrows went up slightly. He said nothing. Reed pulled the rifle off the rack and set it on the counter. Look, I don't know what you were using before you got here, or what program you came from, or what somebody told you about special equipment. But the Black Talon isn't something you just walk up and request. Even if it existed in active form, it would require general-level authorization. He said it like that settled it. Like the words general-level authorization were a door being closed. I know, Olivia said. Then because I have it. The armory went quiet. Not dramatically quiet. Not movie quiet. It was the specific quiet of a room where several people have suddenly redirected their attention to one thing and are now holding very still. Reed stared at her. You have general-level authorization. For the Black Talon. Reed looked at Torres. Torres looked at Cho. Mitchell crossed his arms and watched. Then where's your authorization document? Reed said. His voice had shifted. The amusement was mostly gone. In its place was the careful defensiveness of a man who has suddenly realized he might be on the wrong side of something, but hasn't admitted it yet. Olivia reached into the outer pocket of her field bag and placed a single folded document on the counter. Reed unfolded it. He read it again. His expression moved through several phases, in about 4 seconds: skepticism, confusion, recalibration, and then something he would never have admitted out loud, which was the first real edge of discomfort. The authorization was signed. The classification level on it was 2 grades above anything currently posted in the armory, and the name on the authorization was General William Carter. Reed set the document down carefully. He did not pick up the stamp. He did not reach for the computer. He stood behind the counter and looked at Olivia Hayes with the expression of a man whose mental filing system has just been handed something it doesn't have a folder for. I'll need to verify this, he said. Of course, Olivia said. It could take some time. I'll be in the North Training Bay. She picked up her field bag. She shouldered it. She picked up her old rifle case. She looked at the standard issue rifle Reed had set on the counter between them, looked at it, not with contempt, not with dismissal, but with the calm assessment of someone who has already made peace with a lesser tool, and then she looked back at Reed. Issue me the standard equipment, she said. I'll use that until it's verified. She picked up the standard rifle. She walked out. Nobody in the armory said anything for almost 15 seconds. Then Mitchell said very quietly, "Who is she?" Nobody answered. Because nobody knew. Ryan Mitchell asked around. It was not something he was proud of, going from person to person, working a question sideways, the way you do when you want information, but don't want to look like you need it. He was good enough at it that most people didn't notice. He'd learned the skill over years of operating in environments where the wrong question asked the wrong way got you nothing or got you trouble. But this question didn't feel dangerous. Felt like the kind of thing that had a simple answer he just hadn't landed on yet. Captain Olivia Hayes, Shadow Ridge Advanced Operations. Precision Fire Specialty. Arrived Tuesday morning with an old rifle case and a piece of paper signed by General Carter. He asked the S1 officer who handled personnel assignments. Need to know, the officer said, not unkindly. Her file has a classification block. He asked a warrant officer he'd worked with before who had friends in the assignment pipeline. I can see her name, her rank, her current assignment. Everything before that is flagged. Sorry, man, he asked Torres, who'd been in the armory. She qualified at 500, Torres said, before anyone was out there. Range officer said she ran a full qualification course and then asked for a cold weather adjustment protocol that apparently isn't in our local range manual. What adjustment? That's what I asked. He said it's a high-altitude long-range compensation protocol, something used in mountain environments. He'd only seen it referenced once before in some program documentation. Never actually used here. Mitchell sat with that information. A high-altitude long-range compensation protocol at Fort Raven, in Nevada, where the nearest high-altitude environment was hundreds of miles away. She was already preparing for the mountain. He found that interesting. The Shadow Ridge mission brief happened that afternoon, and Mitchell had his first real look at what they were heading into. The objective was a communications relay facility embedded in the Karthos Ridge mountain range, a complex that had been seized by a paramilitary group called the Vanthor Coalition 6 weeks earlier. The facility wasn't valuable for what it contained. It was valuable for what it controlled, a network relay that, in the wrong hands, could disrupt military communications across a 400-mile operational corridor. Taking it back by direct assault was possible. Casualty estimates made it unacceptable. The alternative was a precision engagement, a single shot from a distance and elevation that would eliminate the coalition's command leadership during a known operational window, destabilize their chain of command, and allow a secondary team to move in during the resulting confusion with dramatically reduced resistance. The problem, as the briefing officer laid it out, was geography. The only viable firing position was 2,100 meters from the target window, a distance that pushed the outer limit of what most precision shooters could accomplish under controlled conditions. These conditions would not be controlled. Karthos Ridge produced unpredictable thermal winds that shifted direction and speed every 30 to 90 seconds. The engagement window, the specific moment when all targets would be in alignment, lasted approximately 11 seconds. The previous simulation runs had used the 4 best qualified snipers currently attached to Fort Raven. 3 had missed, 1 had hit the primary target, but not in time to prevent the secondary from moving. None of them had cleared the scenario. Mitchell watched the briefing officer's face when the simulation results went up on the screen. The man was a good officer, and he kept his expression professional, but Mitchell knew how to read the specific tiredness behind professional. The tiredness that meant we've already exhausted the obvious solutions, and we're now asking questions we didn't think we'd need to ask, Cantor. After the brief, as everyone was gathering their materials, Olpich heard General Carter's voice. Captain Hayes, he watched Olivia stop. Stay for a moment. The other operators filed out. Mitchell was the last one through the door, and he paused, just long enough to see General Carter turn toward Olivia with an expression that wasn't the expression of a commanding officer addressing a subordinate. It was something more careful than that. Something between assessment and acknowledgement. Then the door closed. Mitchell walked down the corridor thinking about 2,100 meters. Thinking about an 11-second window. Thinking about a woman who had requested a weapon that didn't officially exist. He found her on the North Range at 1,800 hours. She was running her own distance calculations not on a computer, on paper, working through a series of agreements in pencil, erasing, recalculating. She had a small weather instrument on the bench beside her that measured wind speed and direction. Every few minutes she'd check it and adjust a number. Mitchell watched her for a while from the edge of the range. Mind if I sit? Olivia looked up. It's a shared range. He sat on the bench across from her. She went back to her calculations. He waited. You're Mitchell, she said without looking up. Yeah. 3rd in the cohort. 2nd now. Reyes transferred out. She made a small adjustment on the paper. Congratulations. He almost smiled. You know the simulation numbers. I read the brief. 3 misses and a partial, Mitchell said. At 2,100 meters with variable thermals. I've been running the math on it since the meeting. And it's not a math problem, Mitchell said. It's a timing problem. The math works. The execution window doesn't give you enough time to correct for wind variation if you're calculating in real time. Olivia stopped writing. She looked at him. You have to pre-calculate the wind cycle, he continued. Read the thermal pattern before you're in position. Internalize the correction before the window opens so you're not compensating during you're already inside the compensation when the shot presents itself. He said it carefully, like someone presenting an idea and waiting to find out if the person across from him already knows it. Olivia looked at him for 3 full seconds. Yes, she said. That was all. How long does the thermal cycle take? Mitchell asked. 17 to 23 seconds. The variance is altitude dependent. But the window is 11 seconds. Yes. So you need to enter the window inside the cycle, not at its start. Yes. Mitchell's back. He looked at her calculations, which he could see were far more complex than anything he'd been working through layers of variables he hadn't even included, compensations for factors he hadn't fully accounted for. He looked at the weather instrument. He looked at her face, which told him nothing useful, except that she had been through this before. Not the math, the problem. The specific shape of this kind of problem mission requirements that sit just outside what normal qualification standards cover and require something else. Something that isn't taught in standard curriculum. You've done this before, he said. Not just the math. The actual shot. Something close to this. Olivia picked up her pencil. Close, she said. How close? She didn't answer. He nodded slowly. Okay, he started to stand, Mitchell. He stopped. Why do you want to know? He thought about it honestly. Because I want to know if the mission is possible. And I want to know if you're the one who can do it. Olivia looked at him for a moment. Then she said, it's possible. And she picked up her pencil and went back to the calculation. Go get some sleep, she said. Tomorrow's going to be long. He got up, gathered his things, and walked back toward the barracks. Halfway there, he stopped and turned around. She was already deep in the calculations again. The small instrument beside her was measuring the wind. She was going to spend the entire night, the wind. He turned and walked back to the barracks, thinking that he had never, in 6 years of operational experience, felt the specific combination of humility and confidence that was now sitting in his chest, the feeling of standing next to something genuinely excellent and recognizing it without fully understanding it. It was not a comfortable feeling, but it was an honest one. The next morning, Reed found the authorization document on General Carter's desk. He'd put it there himself, with a verification request clipped to the front. It was procedure. Someone hands you something signed by the commanding general, you verify. That was not unusual. What was unusual was that General Carter had not called him back immediately, the way he normally did with flag-level queries. Instead, Reed had waited. 1 hour. 2 hours. By mid-morning, he was beginning to think the authorization was forged, not because Olivia seemed like someone who would forge documents, but because the alternative required him to accept a string of conclusions that didn't fit any pattern he recognized. At 11 o'clock, General Carter's aide came to find him. The general wants to see you. Reed straightened his uniform and walked to the command wing. General William Carter was 61 years old, had commanded 4 different operational units before Fort Raven, had 2 combat deployments, and a career's worth of controlled authority behind every word he spoke. He was not a man who performed anger. He was a man who expressed it with precision, which was often more frightening. When Reed entered the office, the general was standing with his back to the door, looking at a topographic map on the wall. Close the door, Carter said. Reed closed it. You processed a request this morning. Yes, sir, from Captain Hayes. For the Black, I know what she requested. Carter turned from the map. His expression wasn't angry. It was something more measured than that. He picked up the authorization document from his desk and looked at it. The document is valid, Sergeant. I signed it myself. Reed kept his face neutral. Yes, sir. You verified it appropriately, and I respect that. What I want to know about is what happened before you verified it. Reed said nothing, because what happened before he verified it was he held up the request in the armory, and the room laughed, and Captain Hayes left with a standard issue rifle, while 3 or 4 people snickered behind her back. Carter knew the answer without being told. Reed could see that in the way the general waited, not like someone expecting information, but like someone giving someone else enough silence to understand what they'd done. She requested authorized equipment, Carter said. On valid authorization, the response she received was not appropriate. No, sir. The Black Talon isn't a legend, Sergeant. It's not a museum piece. It's a precision instrument assigned to a specific program and a specific operator, and that operator is now attached to this base in a role that is relevant to an active mission. When she requested her equipment, she should have received it. The authorization wasn't verified at the time, sir. Then she should have been told it would be verified and treated with professional courtesy in the meantime. Not made into a punchline. Reed stood very still. Yes, sir. Carter set the document down. The Black Talon will be issued to Captain Hayes this afternoon. Full kit. You'll deliver it, personally. Yes, sir. And Sergeant, sir, when you deliver it, you will not explain. You will not apologize in a way that makes this about your feelings. You will hand her the equipment she requested, confirm it's what she needs, and let her work. Yes, sir. She doesn't need your respect, Carter said quietly. She has mine, and she's earned it in ways that most people in this building don't have the clearance to know about. What she needs is for this unit to function professionally. Can you do that? Reed met his eyes. Yes, sir. Carter nodded and turned back to the map. Dismissed. Reed walked back through the command wing with the authorization document folded in his jacket pocket and a very specific kind of discomfort that had nothing to do with the general and everything to do with himself. He had made a judgment. It had been wrong, not wrong in the way that a calculation is wrong. Wrong like a reflex is wrong. The kind of wrong that happens when your brain fills in an answer before the question is finished. He didn't fully know what he was going to do with that. But he knew he was going to hand her the Black Talon, personally, exactly as the general said. And he was going to do it right. Olivia was in the simulation bay when Reed found her. She was running the Karthos Ridge digital model, a terrain simulation the unit used for mission planning, and she was doing it alone, without the full unit present, feeding herself variables and adjusting on the fly. The model showed her firing position in red, the target window in blue, and the thermal wind simulation running as a visible overlay in amber. Reed stopped in the doorway and watched for a moment. She was completely absorbed, not in the dramatic way of someone performing concentration. In the real way, the way that meant the room had ceased to exist for her and only the problem remained. She adjusted a setting, observed the result, made a note on paper, reset the simulation. He'd seen plenty of good shooters. He'd seen operators who were exceptional by any standard metric. What he was watching now was something he didn't have a clean category for. He knocked on the doorframe. Olivia paused the simulation and looked up. Reed walked in. He was carrying the case, the real case, not a replica, not a training version. He set it on the table beside her and stepped back. Black Talon kit, he said. Full configuration. Olivia looked at the case. Reed waited to see what she would do. Part of him expected something, acknowledgement, maybe, or vindication. The kind of moment where someone looks at you and lets you know with their eyes that you owe them something. He had earned that. He knew it. Olivia reached out, unlatched the case, and opened it. She looked at the rifle for several seconds without touching it. Something moved across her face that wasn't quite what Reed expected. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't satisfaction. It was more like recognition, the way you look at something you last saw a long time ago in circumstances you don't revisit casually. Then she picked it up. The way she held it told Reed everything he hadn't known that morning. Not how she stood, not her stance or her grip, though those were right. It was the ease, the absence of any need to demonstrate competence, the way you don't perform your own name when someone asks it. Everything's here, she asked. Full kit. Suppressors, custom optics package, the cold weather ballistic adjustments. Ammunition. Cases 12 through 14 on the shelf behind you. She nodded. She set the rifle down carefully and looked at the case in full. Then she looked at Reed. He had rehearsed something on the way over. Not an apology, Exactly, the general had told him not to make it about his feelings. Something more useful. Something professional. But, standing here, in this room, with this woman who had done nothing wrong and asked for nothing beyond what she was authorized to receive and been laughed at for it, the rehearsed words didn't arrive. What arrived instead was simple. "I should have handled this morning differently," he said. Olivia looked at him. "I don't need you to say that," she said. "I know you don't," he paused. "I needed to say it." She considered that. Then, with nothing performative about it, "Okay." He nodded. "Good luck on the mission, Captain." He turned and walked out. In the hallway, he stopped and stood for a moment. He thought about the authorization form, about the laughter, about the particular ease with which he had dismissed her, not with malice, but with something worse in some ways. Assumption. The reflex assumption that he already knew what he was looking at before he'd finished looking. He thought about what the general had said. "She has mine, and she's earned it in ways that most people in this building don't have the clearance to know about." He didn't know what those ways were. He suspected he never would. But he understood, standing in that hallway, that a person's value was not the same thing as a person's visibility. That competence didn't always announce itself. That the moment you assumed you already knew, the moment you stopped reading and started filling in, was the moment you started making mistakes. He'd made one that morning. He was going to spend a long time thinking about it. Down the corridor, through the closed door of the simulation bay, Captain Olivia Hayes restarted the Karthos Ridge model. She had work to do, and she was already inside it. Mitchell didn't sleep that night. He told himself he was running numbers, the thermal cycle, the engagement window, the ballistic compensation adjustments for altitude and humidity. That was true, but that wasn't the real reason. The real reason was simpler and more uncomfortable. He kept coming back to the image of Olivia Hayes, standing at that armory counter, the authorization document folded in her hot pocket the entire time, saying nothing while Reed held her request up for the room to laugh at. She'd had the document with her. She could have produced it immediately. Could have stopped the whole thing in its first 5 seconds. Instead, she'd stood there, absorbed the entire performance, and then quietly asked for standard equipment. He didn't understand that yet, but he understood that it meant something, and he was the kind of man who couldn't sleep comfortably next to something he didn't understand. By 400, he gave up on the bunk and went to the operations room. Lieutenant Colonel Dana Rice was already there. She was Shadow Ridge's executive officer, 43 years old, 17 years in, the kind of officer who ran a clean operation, not because she was rigid, but because she was thorough. She had short dark hair and a way of reading people that she tried to disguise as paperwork. Mitchell had worked under her for 18 months. He respected her enormously, which made it slightly harder to admit, standing in the doorway of the operations room at 4 in the morning, that he had a question he didn't know how to ask. Rice looked up from her terminal. "You look like a man who's been arguing with himself." "Probably accurate," Mitchell said. He crossed to the coffee station, poured a mug, and sat down across from her. "I want to ask you something about Captain Hayes." Rice's expression stayed neutral. "Ask. Her file is blocked above my clearance." "I know that. I'm not asking you to break classification." He paused. "I just want to know if she's done this before. The kind of shot they're asking for." "Something in that range." Rice looked at him for a moment. Then she closed what she was working on. "Why? Because if the mission turns on one shot from one person, I want to know if that person has ever been in that position before. Not the qualification scores. The real thing." Reese was quiet for several seconds. She turned her coffee mug slowly in her hands, which was a habit Mitchell recognized as meaning she was deciding how much of the truth to give him. "I can't speak to the specifics of what's in her file," Rice said finally. "But I can tell you that when General Carter attached her to this unit, he didn't go through the standard assignment channel. He made a personal call. I took the call. He used a phrase I'd never heard him use before about anyone." She paused. "He said she was the only qualified option." Mitchell absorbed that. "He didn't say the best option." "No, he said the only one." Rice picked up her coffee. That's the kind of language a man uses when he's already exhausted every alternative. When he's not making a choice between good options, he's making a call, because the situation has narrowed to a single name. Mitchell sat with that. Does she know the pressure she's carrying? He asked. What do you think? He thought about the simulation bay, the weather instrument, the paper calculations, the way she'd been at it, before most of the base was awake. Yeah, he said. She knows. Then stop trying to understand her file, Rice said, and start figuring out how to make sure she has everything she needs to do her job. Mitchell nodded and finished his coffee. It was good advice. He was going to spend the rest of the day trying to follow it. The full unit assembled for mission briefing at 800. 16 operators, 2 intelligence analysts, 1 communications specialist, 1 precision fire element, which was Olivia alone, listed on the manifest as PFE-1 with no unit affiliation visible beneath it. Major Leon Torres, no relation to the supply officer, a fact that caused occasional confusion, ran the briefing. He was 45, stocky, with a voice that carried the particular flatness of someone who had delivered bad news in difficult situations, often enough to have made peace with it. He went through the Karthos Ridge schematic, the coalition positions, the secondary team insertion route, the communications blackout protocol. When he reached the precision fire element section, he put Olivia's engagement parameters on the screen. 2,100 meters, 11-second window, variable thermal winds. Probability of wind shift mid-engagement, 73%. 2 operators in the back exchanged a look. Not a hostile look, more like the look 2 people share when a number on a screen is bigger than the number they were expecting. A staff sergeant named Hector Okafor, who had been in the unit for 3 years and had opinions about everything and expressed them with the confidence of a man who was right, often enough to have stopped double-checking, raised his hand. Sir, the probability of mid-engagement wind shift is 73% at that distance. What's the contingency if the shot is missed or indeterminate? Torres looked at him. There isn't one, Okafor blinked. Say again? There is no contingency for a missed shot. If the precision engagement fails, the secondary team does not advance. We abort and reassess. So the entire secondary insertion depends on a single shot. Yes. Okafor turned and looked at Olivia, who was sitting 2 rows ahead of him. She didn't turn around. She was looking at the schematic on the screen, and whatever she was thinking wasn't visible on her face. With respect, sir, Okafor said, what's the basis for confidence that the precision element can clear this shot under those conditions? What's her qualification record at this distance? Torres said classified. Okafor's jaw tightened. Sir, I'm asking about mission viability. My team is on that secondary insertion. If the shot, her record is classified, Sergeant. Her authorization is general level. Her assignment to this mission was approved by General Carter directly. Torres paused. That's the basis for confidence. Okafor was quiet for a moment. Then he said, not loudly, but clearly enough for the 2 rows between him and Olivia, with respect, sir, that's not an answer. That's a signature on a piece of paper. The room went very still. Olivia turned her head then. Slowly, she looked at Okafor over her shoulder. Her expression was not angry. It was the expression of someone reading a situation, accurately cataloging it, filing it, not reacting to it. You're right, she said. Everyone looked at her. A signature isn't an answer, she continued. If I were on your team and someone else was taking the shot, I'd want more than that too. Okafor said nothing. So ask me what you actually want to know, Olivia said. Not through the major, ask me. The room held its breath. Torres made no move to intervene. This was, Mitchell observed, because Torres was smart enough to recognize that what was happening right now was more useful than anything he could add. Okafor looked at Olivia for a moment. Then, can you make the shot? Yes. At 2,100 meters with a 73% probability of mid-engagement wind shift. Yes. How? Olivia turned fully in her seat. The thermal cycle on Karthos Ridge runs 17 to 23 seconds at operational altitude. The engagement window is 11 seconds. Most shooters try to enter at the beginning of a stable cycle and complete within it. That's wrong. By the time you enter, you've already consumed a third of your window, confirming your correction. She paused. You pre-calculate the cycle. You enter the window inside the stable phase, not at its edge. You're not correcting during the shot, you're already corrected, before the window opens. The wind shift isn't a problem you solve during execution. It's a variable you've already accounted for. Okafor stared at her. You'd have to know the thermal pattern before you're in position. I've been studying it for 36 hours. From simulation data, historical meteorological records, and the actual wind instrument readings I've been taking every 4 hours from the North Range since yesterday morning. Silence. Okafor looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at the screen. Then he looked back at her. What's your drift correction? At 2,100 meters in a 6-knot crosswind, shifting to variable 8. Olivia told him. Precisely. Without hesitating. With the specific subvalues that a person doesn't produce by memorizing a formula, but by having internalized the physics so completely that the number is simply available, the way your phone number is available, not retrieved, but known. Okafor was quiet for about 5 seconds. Okay, he said. Just that. But the way he said it told the room that Hector Okafor, who had never in 3 years of working with Torres given a qualified answer that short, had received an answer that was sufficient. Torres moved on with the briefing. Mitchell looked at the back of Olivia's head and thought, she didn't prove anything to him. She gave him information. There's a difference. He was going to spend time thinking about that distinction. The unit had 2 days before insertion. Those 2 days had their own rhythm gear checks, communications rehearsals, route analysis, the specific kind of productive tension that a good unit generates before a mission that it doesn't fully know how to feel about yet. The tension wasn't fear exactly. It was the alertness of people who understood the stakes and were choosing to be ready rather than anxious. Olivia moved through those tudes differently from the rest of the unit. She wasn't separate from the group. She showed up to everything, participated in the planning sessions, answered questions when they were directed at her. But she also had a schedule that ran parallel to the unit's schedule, built around the Black Talon and the Karthos Ridge simulation and the wind data she was collecting and analyzing every 4 hours, with a persistence that, once people noticed it, became a kind of reference point. Okafor noticed it first. He'd come down to the North Range on the evening of the first day for his own weapon maintenance and found Olivia running adjustments on the Black Talon, with a focus that made him feel, briefly, like he was interrupting something private. He almost left. Instead he stayed, because he was the kind of man who stayed. Range is open, Olivia said without looking up. She was calibrating the optics, a process that on this particular rifle was not what Okafor would have called intuitive. The scope adjustments were more granular than standard equipment, the calibration marks, indexed in units he didn't immediately recognize. What's the scope indexed in, he asked. Microradians. Not no. He sat down at the next bench and began breaking down his own rifle. For a few minutes they worked in parallel without speaking, which was, Okafor discovered, not uncomfortable. It was the comfortable silence of two people who were both doing something real and didn't need to perform the fact of being in the same space. I was out of line in the briefing, Okafor said. Olivia didn't stop her calibration. No, you weren't. I was direct. Your team is on secondary insertion. You needed to know the shot was real. That's not out of line, that's operational responsibility. She made a fine adjustment and checked the result. I'd rather have you ask hard than stay quiet and doubt. Okafor looked at the side of her face. Most people don't take it that way. Most people treat doubt like an insult, Olivia said. It's not. It's information about what someone needs. He thought about that. What do you need from my team? For the shot to work? Communications discipline during the window. No radio traffic on the primary frequency for 30 seconds before I call the shot. If someone breaks that, the distraction could cost me a half-second on the final adjustment. She paused. A half-second at 2,100 meters is the difference between center mass and a miss. Done, Okafor said. I'll brief my guys personally. Thank you. He went back to his rifle. Then the drift correction you gave in the briefing. For 6 knots shifting to variable 8. Yes. I ran it on the ballistic calculator after the meeting. It matched. Olivia looked at him then. Something in her face moved, not surprise, not quite, but something close to the feeling of recognition when a person who's been prepared to be doubted realizes they're not doubted anymore. I know, she said simply. Okafor almost smiled. Yeah. I figured you did. He locked down his rifle. Get some sleep at some point, Captain. You're no good to anyone on 20 hours awake. I'll sleep on the transport. That's what I said the last 3 missions. He stood and shouldered his kit. It's never true, he left. Olivia watched him go. She went back to the calibration. The first real crack in the unit's skepticism didn't happen at the range or in the briefing room. It happened in the mess hall on the evening of the 2nd day, when a young analyst named Priya Ose made a mistake. Ose was 24, 8 months in theater, and deeply good at her job in the specific way that people who came to intelligence work after a serious academic background were good at it: thorough, systematic, methodical. She was not, by her own admission, good at the interpersonal parts. She had told Mitchell this herself during their first week working together, with the clarity of someone who has accepted a fact about themselves, rather than being defeated by it. She had been assigned to cross-reference the meteorological data for the Karthos Ridge window. It was a support task, not primary analysis supplementary. She was good enough that supplementary tasks didn't take her long. What she found, though, wasn't supplementary. She found a discrepancy in the operational meteorological model being used for the mission brief. The model was sourced from a regional weather service database and was accurate as far as it went, but it was indexed to a weather station at the base of the ridge, not at operational altitude. The difference in altitude between this station and the firing position created a systematic error in the projected wind speeds of approximately 12%. 12% over 2,100 meters was significant. Osi sat with this discovery for about 90 seconds before she did something that, given her age and her rank and the specific social dynamics of the unit, took more nerve than most of the operators in the unit would have given her credit for. She went directly to Olivia. She found her in the simulation bay, running the Karthos Ridge model again. She knocked. Olivia waved her in. I found something, Osi said. I don't know if you already have it. Show me. Osi showed her the discrepancy, the altitude differential, the systematic error, the 12% variance in projected wind speed. Olivia looked at the data for about 50 seconds without speaking. Then she pulled out her paper calculations and showed Osi a section near the bottom of the 3rd page. Osi looked at it. The altitude correction was there. Already built into the calculation, applied precisely, indexed, to the actual operational altitude rather than the base station. Oh, Osi said. You caught it anyway, Olivia said. That matters. I was 2 days behind you. You were doing your job independently. Olivia looked at her. That's not behind, that's verification. Do you know how valuable it is to have someone independently verify a critical calculation and come to the same result? Osi blinked. I came to a different result. The base model was wrong. And you found it and corrected it, which means if I had made an error, you might have caught it. Olivia paused. That's not a small thing. On a mission like this, an independent check on a critical variable isn't redundancy. It's insurance. Osi stood there for a moment, visibly recalibrating. Thank you, she said finally. Thank you, Olivia said. Seriously. Osi left. She went back to her terminal and sat down and thought about what had just happened, not the meteorological data but the conversation. The way Olivia had responded. No irritation at being shown a discovery she'd already made. No dismissal of the younger analyst's work. She had taken it seriously. Had framed it as useful. Had meant it. Osi pulled up the full mission file and started going through supplementary data with the kind of fresh attention that comes when someone has made you feel like your attention is worth something. By the end of the evening, she'd found 2 more small discrepancies in the support documentation, both minor, both already accounted for in Olivia's calculations, both worth catching anyway. She brought them both to Olivia. Olivia looked at them both carefully. Said thank you both times. Meant it both times. Mitchell heard about the exchange from Okafor, who heard about it from Torres, who had been told by Ose herself when she submitted her corrected data package. By the time the story reached Mitchell, it had accumulated the slight distortion that all second-hand stories carry, but the essential shape of it was intact. The young analyst had found an error, brought it to the precision element, and been treated like her contribution mattered. That shouldn't have been remarkable. The fact that it was remarkable said something about the way people normally got treated, and Mitchell sat with that for a while before he decided to stop thinking about it and go do something useful. What he did was go to the armory and requisition the additional cold weather suppressors Olivia had requested for the Black Talon. Reed had already processed the request. The suppressors were packed and ready. She put in the request at 600, Reed said, handing over the package. This morning? This morning. Mitchell looked at the package. She's been up since before 600. She's been up since before I got in, Reed said. Which was 530. He paused. She came by personally. Picked up the suppressors and signed for them. Didn't say much. Another pause. Said thank you. Mitchell nodded. She says thank you to everyone, he said. It wasn't a criticism. He was just noting it, Reed said. I noticed. Mitchell picked up his own gear and turned to go. Mitchell, Reed said. He turned back. Reed looked like a man choosing his words more carefully than usual. Is she going to be able to make the shot? Mitchell looked at him. Yeah, he said. I think she is. Reed nodded. He said simply. Mitchell walked back to the operations room, thinking about the way Reed had said it, not with relief exactly, but with something more personal. With the specific investment of a man who had made a mistake and was now quietly hoping for the version of events where it didn't cost anyone anything. He understood that feeling. He'd had it himself in other contexts. It was not comfortable. But it was the right thing to feel when you'd been wrong, and the fact that Reed was feeling it meant something. The night before insertion, General Carter came to the operations room. He didn't call a formation. He didn't give a speech. He walked through the room at 2,100 hours, spoke individually to 3 or 4 of the senior operators, looked at the mission documentation, and then went to the simulation bay. Olivia was there. She was not running the simulation anymore. She was sitting at the bench with the Black Talon field stripped across the surface in front of her, cleaning and reassembling with the methodical care of someone who has done this specific task so many times that the hands move correctly while the mind runs elsewhere. Carter stood in the doorway. You don't have to be in here at 2,100, he said. I know. She didn't look up. He came in and sat across from her. He watched her work. She was almost done. The major components were reassembled, just the final checks remaining. How's the thermal data looking? He asked. Cycle is running 17 to 20 seconds. Tighter variance than the historical average. That's better for us. Confidence level? She looked up at him then. It was the first time Mitchell, who had come to the doorway behind Carter and stopped there, not wanting to interrupt, had seen her look at the general directly. There was something in that look that was different from how she looked at anyone else. Not deference. Not performance. Something that had the quality of familiarity, 2 people who have been in a difficult room together before and don't need to explain what that means. Hi, she said. Carter nodded. The team? Better than I expected, she said. Okafor runs a tight secondary. His people communicate clean, a pause. Mitchell asks the right questions. Carter glanced over his shoulder, saw Mitchell in the doorway, and turned back to Olivia without commenting on it. Anyone else I should know about? Osi, the analyst. She's sharper than her assignment suggests. Olivia finished the final assembly check and set the rifle down. She should be doing primary analysis, not support. I'll note it, Carter said. Please, he stood. Get some sleep. You're the second person who's told me that tonight. We're both right. She almost smiled at that, almost. I know. Carter turned to leave. He paused in the doorway next to Mitchell, who straightened slightly. She brief you on the thermal cycle? Carter asked him quietly. Yes, sir, good. Stay close to her on the approach. Not close enough to crowd her. Close enough that she knows someone has her back. Yes, sir. Carter walked out. Mitchell looked into the simulation bay. Olivia was doing a final check on the optics, holding the rifle up toward the light, closing one eye, adjusting a fraction. You heard all of that, she said without looking at him. Most of it, Mitchell said. The part about asking the right questions. Yes. She lowered the rifle and looked at him. You do, she said simply. It matters more than you think. He wasn't sure how to respond to that, so he said, try to sleep. I will you? The corner of her mouth moved. Probably not. But I appreciate the sentiment, he nodded. He turned to go, then stopped, because there was something he'd been carrying since the armory and he hadn't found the right moment to put it down. At the armory, he said, when Reed held up your request. You had the authorization document the whole time. Olivia waited. Why didn't you show it? She was quiet for a moment. Not evasive, thinking. Because I wanted to see what the room was, she said finally. Before I changed it. He looked at her. If I show the document immediately, the room changes. People perform differently when they know the authorization exists. I don't learn anything real about who I'm working with. She paused. What I saw was useful. What did you see? I saw who laughed, she said. And I saw who didn't. Mitchell stood very still. You didn't, she said. Neither did Cho. Reed led the room, followed him, because rooms follow whoever moves first. That's not character, that's physics. She paused. But you watched. You paid attention. You asked around afterward. You knew I was asking around. Small base, she said. People talk. Another pause. You were trying to figure out if the mission was possible. That's the right question. It means you care about the outcome more than the social calculation. He stood there. Get some sleep, Mitchell, she said, and turned back to the rifle. He walked back to the barracks and lay down on his bunk in the dark and stared at the ceiling. He thought about the armory, about who had laughed and who hadn't, about the specific value of a room full of people who don't yet know they're being read, who show you who they actually are because they don't think it counts. He thought about what she'd said. I wanted to see what the room was before I changed it. He'd never thought about a situation that way, as something to read before you altered it. He'd spent 6 years developing the instinct to act fast, adapt fast, close the gap between information and response. She'd done the opposite. She'd held still and gathered. He thought about which instinct was more useful. He thought he might have been wrong about which one was the difficult one. At some point after midnight, he fell asleep. In the simulation bay, the light stayed on until almost 300. Then it went off. And in the morning, Olivia Hayes was ready. The transport lifted at 430. 16 operators, 1 analyst, 1 precision fire element, and the specific silence that fills a military aircraft when everyone on board understands exactly what the next 12 hours could cost. Mitchell had been on enough insertions to know the different textures of pre-mission, quiet, the nervous kind, where people's eyes move too fast and hands find things to adjust that don't need adjusting, and the operational kind, where everyone has finished being afraid and started being ready. This transport carried the operational kind, mostly. Okafor sat with his secondary team in the rear section, running a final comm check on each man's radio with the patient thoroughness of someone who has learned, at significant personal cost, that the things you skip in prep are always the things that matter. He went down the line without speaking, nodded at each confirmation, marked his checklist. OC was forward, her laptop open, running final cross-checks on the meteorological data. She had been doing this since 300, when Mitchell had passed her in the corridor on his way to gear up and seen the light still on under her door. She looked up when he passed, started to say something, then seemed to decide it wasn't the moment. He understood. There was a version of the night before, a mission where words helped, and a version where they didn't. She was smart enough to know which version this was. Olivia sat near the rear ramp with the Black Talon case across her knees, closed and locked. She was not running calculations. She was not checking equipment. She was sitting perfectly still, with her eyes open, doing the thing that Mitchell had come to recognize over the last 2 days as her particular form of preparation, the deep internal processing that looked like nothing from the outside but was, he suspected, where all the real work happened. Where 36 hours of wind data and simulation runs and paper calculations collapsed into something that wasn't thinking anymore. Something closer to knowing. He sat across from her. She didn't acknowledge him, which he'd expected. He didn't speak, which she'd expected. They flew north toward the mountains. The insertion point was a high plateau 12 kilometers from the Karthos Ridge facility, far enough to avoid the coalition perimeter sensors, close enough that the approach could be completed on foot within the operational window. The secondary team would split from Olivia and Mitchell at the 4-kilometer mark, circling east to their staging position, while Olivia and Mitchell continued to the firing overlook. Mitchell was her security element. One operator, no support fire capability, no extraction asset until the shot was confirmed. His job was to keep anything from interfering with her before the window opened. After the window, they would extract together on the primary route. If the primary route was compromised, they had 2 alternates. If both alternates were compromised, they had a contingency plan that Torres had briefed with the particular flatness of a man who hoped no one would ever need it. The ramp dropped at 612. Cold air came in hard. Everyone moved fast and cleaned 16 people off the aircraft in under 40 seconds, spreading into their designated positions without commands. The choreography of a unit that has rehearsed the first 5 minutes until the first 5 minutes require no thought. Okafor caught Olivia's eye as his team split east at the 4-kilometer marker. He said nothing. He nodded once. She nodded back. It was the entire conversation they needed. The approach to the firing overlook took 2 hours and 40 minutes. Mitchell moved behind Olivia and slightly left, maintaining a spacing that kept him close enough to act and far enough to stay out of her field of attention. He watched the terrain around them. He watched her. He tried not to do the thing he'd been doing for 2 days, which was run the numbers again, because running the numbers again was not useful, and the numbers hadn't changed. What changed on the approach was the wind. He felt it first as a variation in direction, not a shift in the forecast sense, just the natural complexity of mountain air, moving around a ridge the way it always moves differently in reality than in models. Then, about 40 minutes from the overlook, the variation became something else. A pattern change. Not dramatic, not alarming, but real. He pulled out his wind instrument and took a reading. He didn't say anything immediately. He took 3 readings over 4 minutes, logging each one. Then he moved up beside Olivia and showed her the instrument. She looked at the readings without stopping, read them, processed them, and said, "I know. It's not the forecast pattern. No, it shifted about 20 minutes ago." She kept moving. "The cycle is still running. The base interval is intact. But the initiation point has moved about 8 seconds earlier in the sequence." He looked at her. 8 seconds, yes. That changes your entry timing. Yes. By how much? Enough to matter. A pause. Not for drama, but because she was working while talking. "I can correct for it. Are you sure?" She stopped, turned and looked at him with an expression that was not irritated and not reassuring. It was simply direct. The look of someone who has been asked a question that deserves an honest answer and is giving one. "I'm sure I can adjust the calculation," she said. "I'm not sure the adjustment will be enough until I'm in position and have real-time readings from the overlook. At that point, I'll have about 8 minutes before the window opens to finalize." She paused. "That's enough time. 8 minutes. 8 minutes is more than I've had before." He looked at her. "Before," he said. She turned and kept moving. He followed, thinking about the word before, and what it implied about conditions that made 8 minutes feel generous. They reached the overlook at 917. The window opened at 958. 41 minutes. Olivia opened the Black Talon case and began the final setup with a speed that was not rushed. Mitchell established his security position and started running a systematic check of their perimeter, moving quietly in a wide arc and returning, logging what he found, which was nothing. The coalition's sensor perimeter was oriented toward the eastern approach, which was where the obvious route lay. Nobody had expected anyone to come over the high ridge. Nobody had expected someone to set up at 2,100 meters either. At 931, Olivia had the rifle fully set and was running her real-time wind readings. Mitchell came back from his perimeter check and crouched beside her. "Anything I need to know about?" "The wind," she said. "Consistent with what we saw on approach, mostly." She made a small note. "There's a secondary effect from the eastern face. Doesn't appear in the simulation model. It's a reflection off a rock formation about 800 meters out. It's adding a variable component to the last 200 meters of the bullet path." He was quiet for a moment. "You've corrected for it?" "I'm correcting for it now. Can you account for it fully?" She paused. "I can account for its pattern. The magnitude varies." She took another reading. Made another note. "It's within the correction range. But it's new. Everything in the field is new," she said. "That's the field." He absorbed that. "What do you need from me?" "Radio silence starting at 950. If you have to communicate, after that, right." She glanced at him. "Literally. On paper. Nothing audible done. And stay exactly where you are. No movement after 950. Sound carries differently up here than at base altitude." He nodded and settled into his position. At 938, his radio crackled. Okafor's voice. "Secondary element in staging position. Ready on your mark." Mitchell looked at Olivia. She held up 2 fingers. 20 minutes, he transmitted. "Maintain radio silence from 950. Acknowledge." "Acknowledged. Radio silence 950. A pause. "Tell her good luck." Mitchell looked at Olivia. She was already back in the data. He said into the radio, "She doesn't need it." He heard very faintly what might have been Okafor almost laughing. The channel went quiet. At 944, something changed. Mitchell felt it before he identified it, that specific alertness that years of operational experience builds into the body. The way certain inputs bypass conscious processing and go directly to the part of the brain that moves first and explains later. He scanned his sector, nothing visible. He listened. Wind, distance sounds, the normal acoustic landscape of a mountain approach. Then he heard it properly. A radio transmission. Not his radio. Not Okafor's channel. A different frequency, close enough to be audible as a bleed through, someone transmitting on a coalition frequency within a range that put them significantly closer to this overlook than they should have been. He held very still and listened. He could not hear the content, just the characteristic bursts of military radio traffic, short transmissions, the spacing of a unit doing position checks. 2 sources, maybe 3. He turned to Olivia and caught her eye. He held up 3 fingers, pointed to the eastern approach below and to the right, and made the slow movement gesture that meant unknown personnel, moving. Olivia's eyes went to her watch. 944, 14 minutes to the window. She looked at him. Her face was controlled, but he could read the calculation happening behind it, not panic, not even alarm in the ordinary sense, but the rapid processing of a changed situation. She was reweighting variables. He could see it. She held up 7 fingers, then pointed at herself, then at the rifle. 7 minutes. "I need 7 minutes once the window opens," he nodded. He checked his watch. If the coalition personnel reached a sightline to this position before the window closed, the mission was over. If they arrived after the shot, it was a different problem, serious, but different. Manageable. He did the math. He needed to know how fast they were moving and how far away they were. He moved to the edge of his position and listened again. The radio transmissions were fractionally louder, closer. The spacing between them was shortening, which meant the units were either compressing their position check interval because they detected something, or they were on a standard sweeps moving this direction as part of a routine patrol. He came back to Olivia and held up his notebook. Wrote, "Patrol sweep or reaction. Can't confirm." She read it. Wrote back, "Does it change your job?" He looked at what she'd written. He thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. No, it didn't. His job was to keep anything from interfering with her before the window closed. Whether the approaching element was reacting to a detected intrusion or running a scheduled sweep didn't change what he needed to do. He wrote, "No." She nodded and went back to the wind data. 950. Radio silence. Mitchell checked his weapon, verified his sight lines, and cataloged his options in the calm, systematic way that training builds and experience sharpens, not detached, never detached, but organized. 2 coalition personnel, possibly 3, approaching from the eastern face below. Estimated time to sightline, 12 to 18 minutes based on the audio pattern. Window opened at 958. Olivia needed 7 minutes inside the window. The math was tight. It was not impossible, he settled in. At 956, Olivia made her final wind calculation. He watched her work without watching her peripherally. The way you monitor something important, without giving it the kind of direct attention that becomes its own distraction. She made 3 small adjustments to the scope, checked the suppressor alignment, ran a final manual check on the bolt. Then she went still. The kind of still that isn't absence of activity, but its highest concentration, every physical and mental resource collapsed into a single point of focus. He had never seen anyone go that still. It was not trained stillness. It was achieved stillness, the product of something he didn't have a name for but recognized as real. 958. The window opened. Below them, 2,100 meters and a mountain of air away, in a communications facility that could not see them and did not know they were there, an 11-second clock had started running. He heard the wind. He heard his own breathing, which he made slow. He heard, at the edge of perception, the movement of the coalition patrol below, closer now, not yet at a sight line but moving. A minute away, maybe less. He did not move, he did not transmit. He held everything still and let Olivia work. The shot came at 1001. Not a crack, the suppressor collapsed it to a sharp mechanical report that died inside 4 meters, swallowed by the wind and the mountain and the distance. He felt the concussive pressure in his sternum, the physical signature of a large caliber round releasing, and then there was nothing audible at all. He waited 1 second, 2, 3. His radio set to minimum volume, held to his ear, broke silence with Okafor's voice. 2 words, target down, then secondary clear, moving. Mitchell exhaled. He turned to Olivia. She was already breaking down the Black Talon, moving with the controlled speed of someone for whom the emotional processing of a successful shot happens after the rifle is packed, not before. Her hands were steady. Her face was the face of someone finishing a job. Below and to the right, the coalition patrol was still moving. 40 seconds, maybe 50, to a sight line. "We need to move," Mitchell said quietly. "I know." She had the case latched. She stood. "Primary route? Let me check." He listened. The patrol sounds were moving, but the direction had changed. They'd diverted slightly north, following a ridgeline that would take them away from the primary extraction route rather than toward it. He almost couldn't believe it, but the acoustic evidence was clear. "Primary is open," he said. She shouldered the case. "Then let's go." They moved. Okafor's secondary team reached the facility in 11 minutes. The coalition's command structure, without its leadership, fractured almost immediately. 3 of the 7 remaining personnel surrendered within the first 4 minutes. The other 4 attempted to regroup in the eastern corridor and were contained without fatal contact. The facility was secured at 1024. Mitchell received the confirmation transmission at 1031, when he and Olivia were 2 kilometers down the primary extraction route and moving hard. He passed it to Olivia. Without comment, she read it, nodded once, and kept moving. He watched her face for something: relief, satisfaction, the particular release that comes after high tension successfully resolved. He saw none of those things. What he saw instead was the look of someone who had expected the outcome and was now simply moving to the next thing. Not because she was cold, not because it hadn't mattered, but because the outcome, had been real to her before the shot, and becoming real after it didn't change the shape of what she'd already carried. He thought about that for most of the 2-kilometer walk. The debrief happened at 1400, back at Fort Raven. Torres ran it. Carter sat in. Everyone who'd been on the mission was present, plus Osei, who had been monitoring communications from the operations center and had a data package to present on the facility's electronic signature before and after the engagement. Osei's hands were shaking slightly when she stood up to present. Not badly, not visibly unless you were watching for it. Mitchell was watching for it because he'd seen her in the corridor at 300, and because he knew from the way she'd spent the last 3 days that she had been carrying the weight of the meteorological data check like a personal responsibility. If the wind data had been wrong, if her independent verification had missed something, if the data package was clean, thorough, well organized, she presented it with the clarity of someone who had done the work and stood behind it. Torres said, "Good work, specialist." Osei sat down. She exhaled very slowly. Mitchell saw it and looked away to give her the moment. Torres went through the mission timeline: insertion, approach, engagement, secondary advance, facility secured. He was methodical and factual, and the room was attentive, in the way rooms are attentive when what happened was worth paying attention to. When he reached the precision engagement segment, he put the parameters back on the screen. 2,100 meters. Variable wind. 11-second window. 1 shot. He looked at Olivia, who was sitting at the end of the table with the Black Talon case on the floor beside her. "Captain Hayes. Mission outcome assessment. Objective achieved," Olivia said. The wind data changed on approach. Secondary effect from the eastern face. "You adjusted in position." "Yes, adjustment successful." "Yes." Torres looked around the room. "Is there anything about the precision engagement that the debrief should capture? Anything that affects future mission planning in similar environments?" Olivia considered this for a moment. The eastern face effect should be added to the terrain model. It's not in the current simulation data. Future planning for this operational area should account for it. "Understood. I'll flag it for the terrain team." Torres made a note. "Anything else?" "The 8-minute pre-window calculation window was adequate," Olivia said. "For the secondary effect specifically, 10 minutes would be preferable. If the insertion timeline allows it." Torres nodded. "Noted." He looked at Carter. Carter said nothing. He simply looked at Olivia with the expression Mitchell had seen in the simulation bay, not performance, not ceremony. The look of someone who had been correct about a judgment and was not going to make it smaller by saying so out loud. Okafor spoke without raising his hand. "I want to say something for the record." Torres looked at him. "Go ahead." "I questioned the precision fire elements qualification in the initial brief," Okafor said. "I stand by the question. It was operationally appropriate. I want to also say, for the record, that what I watched on this mission was the best executed precision engagement I've seen in 11 years. He paused. "I've been on missions with the best qualified shooters this unit has produced. What I saw today was different. I want that in the record." The room was quiet. Torres said, "Noted." Okafor looked at Olivia. "Thank you, Captain." Olivia looked back at him. "Your secondary team ran a clean advance. 11 minutes to facility secured. That's the other half of the shot working." Okafor absorbed that. For a man who usually had a ready response to everything, he sat with that for a moment before he nodded. After the debrief, people dispersed in the way units disperse after successful operations, with the specific energy of people who have been at high tension for a long time and are now allowed to let it go. There was noise in the corridor, voices that had been controlled becoming less controlled. Someone laughed, Okafor, actually, responding to something one of his team said, and the laugh had the specific quality of pressure releasing, of a room finally allowed to breathe. Osei found Mitchell in the corridor. "Can I show you something?" she asked. He followed her to her terminal. She pulled up the full meteorological data set from the mission, before, during, after. She'd been logging wind readings from the overlook position sensors during the engagement window. overlaid on the data from Olivia's approach instrument. "Look at the wind pattern at 1001, she said. He looked. At 1001, the exact time of the shot, the eastern face reflection effect had produced a magnitude shift at the edge of its range. The variable component Olivia had noted, the one she'd said was within her correction range but had a magnitude variance. At that specific second, the magnitude had gone to the high end of its variance. "That's a significant deviation," Mitchell said quietly. "Yes." Osei's voice was careful. In the last half-second of the bullet's patrol, there was a lateral deflection potential that the corrected calculation would have underestimated by approximately. "How much?" she told him. He looked at the screen for a long moment. "And it still hit," he said. "Center of intended target," Osei said. "I pulled the facility camera data from the facility's own security system. Okafor's team recovered it. The impact point was within half an inch of the calculated aim point." Mitchell stood very still. At that magnitude deviation in the last half-second, the correction should have produced a miss. Not by much, not a wild miss, not a missed entirely miss, but a miss. By the operational definition. Enough to change the outcome. How? Osei looked at him. "I don't know," she said honestly. "The physics says it should have deviated. The data says it didn't." She paused. "Either the correction she calculated was more refined than anything I can reconstruct from the available variables, or—" She stopped. "Or—" Osei was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, it was carefully. "Or she made a final adjustment inside the window. In real time. In the last fraction of a second before the shot. Something that wasn't pre-calculated, that was read in the moment and applied faster than I can model as a conscious cognitive process." Mitchell stared at the screen. Osei said, very quietly, she felt the wind change. And she corrected for it, while she was already in the trigger sequence. He looked at the data. He thought about the stillness he'd seen. The specific absolute quality of her concentration in the moments before the shot. The way it had looked like nothing from the outside. The way he'd thought it was the highest concentration of activity, not its absence. He hadn't been wrong. He'd been looking at the right thing without fully understanding what he was seeing. "Does this go in the debrief record?" he asked. "I'm going to present it to Torres," Osei said. "And General Carter." She hesitated. "I thought you should see it first." "Because you were there." He nodded. He looked at the data for another moment. Then he said, "Good call." He walked back down the corridor. He thought about 2,100 meters. About the eastern face wind reflection that hadn't been in the model. About a variable the simulation had never accounted for and that a woman had read in real time and corrected it for in the fraction of a second before a trigger broke. He thought about the armory. About Reed holding up the request form. About the room laughing. He thought about what competence looked like from the outside, how it could look like nothing, how it could look like a quiet woman with an old rifle case, standing at a counter, saying nothing, while a room performed its certainty. He thought about how the certainty and the competence had occupied the same room that morning, and only one of them had been real. He reached the end of the corridor. He stopped and stood there for a moment. He'd been in the field for 6 years. He'd worked with good people. He'd worked with excellent people. He'd worked with one or two who were, by any honest assessment, operating at a level that made the word excellent feel insufficient. He had never, until this week, understood the difference between watching someone who was very good and being in the presence of someone for whom the word good was simply the wrong category. He turned and walked back toward the operations room. There was a lot of work still to do, but something had changed in the room. In the unit, in the specific atmosphere of a place where a thing has happened that everyone understands, but nobody has the right words for yet. The mission was over. What it had taught them was only beginning to settle. Osei presented her findings to Torres and General Carter at 1700 that same afternoon. Mitchell was not in the room. He heard about it afterward from Torres, who came to find him in the operations room, with an expression that Mitchell had learned to read over 18 months as the expression Torres wore when something had happened that exceeded the categories he normally used to process things. "The analyst's data package," Torres said, sitting down across from Mitchell. You saw it before she presented. Yes. The eastern face deviation at the moment of the shot. Yes. Torres looked at the table for a moment. He was not a man who looked at tables. He was a man who looked at people and problems and solutions. When he looked at the table, it meant the problem didn't have a clean solution shape, and he was still working on it. Carter watched the whole presentation without speaking. Torres said. OC laid out the physics, the deviation magnitude, the impact data from the recovered camera footage. Center of target within half an inch. He paused. When she finished, Carter asked her one question. Mitchell waited. He asked her if the data was verified independently. She said she'd run it 3 times and would welcome a 4th set of eyes. He said he'd have someone from the ballistics unit review it. Torres looked up. He wasn't questioning her work. He was making sure the record was airtight. Why? Torres looked at him. Because he's going to submit it. Mitchell stared. Submit it where? Program documentation. The Black Talon precision program. The Karthos Ridge, the specific parameters. The in-window adjustment. The outcome is going to become part of the official program record. Torres paused. Carter said it's the most precisely documented extreme-range engagement in the program's history. He wants it on record, accurately. Mitchell sat with that. The most precisely documented extreme-range engagement in the program's history. A shot that the room had laughed at before it existed. Does she know? He asked. Carter told her this afternoon. Before OC's presentation, Torres stood. She said, and I'm quoting because Carter quoted it to me directly, she said, "Make sure OC's name is on the documentation." She caught the altitude error in the base meteorological model. That's part of what made the record accurate. He walked out. Mitchell sat alone in the operations room for a long time. He was thinking about what it meant to be the kind of person who, at the moment of being told their work, was going into the permanent record of one of the most classified precision programs in the military's history, immediately redirected to making sure someone else got credit for their contribution. He was thinking about how that instinct, that specific, reflexive, unperformed instinct, was not something you taught, was not something you built through training or experience or instruction. It came from somewhere more fundamental than any of that. He was thinking that he had spent 6 years believing that excellence was primarily a technical quality, a matter of skill and preparation and the ability to perform under pressure. He was beginning to understand that the best version of it was something else entirely. Reed heard about OC's data package from Cho, who had a friend in the ballistics unit who'd been pulled in for the independent verification. By the time the information reached Reed, it had gone through 3 people and lost some of its precision, but the essential shape was intact. The shot at Karthos Ridge had included an in-the-moment correction for an unmodeled wind variable. Executed in the last fraction of a second before the trigger broke, that should not have been physically achievable at that distance under those conditions. Reed sat with this information in the armory at the end of his shift after Cho had gone home and the room was quiet. He sat there for almost 20 minutes. He thought about the request form, about the way he'd held it up, about the laughter that had followed his laughter first, the room following, about the document she'd had in her field bag the entire time, which she hadn't produced because she'd wanted to see what the room was before she changed it. She'd seen him. She'd seen exactly who he was at that moment. Not the version he performed for inspections and evaluations. Not the professional face he put on for senior officers, the actual version. The version that filled in answers before questions were finished, that categorized based on appearance, that made a room laugh, and felt comfortable doing it. She'd seen that version, and she'd said nothing. She'd accepted standard issue equipment and walked out and spent the next 2 days building toward a mission that ended with a shot that was going into the permanent record of a classified precision program. Reed got up from the stool. He went to the armory manifest and pulled the log from the morning Olivia had come in. He looked at it, the request, the notation of his verification query, the timeline. He looked at the time she'd arrived, the time she'd left with the standard rifle, the time the authorization came back, verified. 3 hours. She'd used standard issue equipment for 3 hours while his verification request sat on a desk. He closed the log. He picked up his jacket and his keys, and he left the armory, locking it behind him. He walked down the corridor and out through the side door that opened toward the North Range. The range was empty. The wind was doing what wind did in Nevada, in the evening, moving without particular purpose, crossing the open ground, going wherever it went. Reed stood there for a while. He didn't have a dramatic realization. He didn't have a speech forming in his head. He had something quieter and less comfortable than either of those things, the specific feeling of understanding, without any softening around the edges. That the version of yourself you thought you were and the version you actually are can be very different, and the gap between them can stay hidden for years until a single moment opens it up, and you have to stand in front of it. He'd been good at his job for a long time. He'd been fair, or thought he'd been fair. He processed equipment with efficiency and accuracy. He treated everyone by the same standard. He'd believed that, sincerely. But there was a version of fairness that looked identical to fairness from the inside and was not fair at all, where the standard you applied was the same across everyone but the categories you put people in before you. Applied the standard were not equally distributed. Where your first look at a person already contained a conclusion that all the standard processing afterward only confirmed rather than examined. That was what he'd done, and the person on the receiving end had not argued, not corrected, not challenged. She'd accepted it and gone to work and produced something that would outlast the moment by years. He turned and walked back inside. He had something to do tomorrow morning. Olivia was in the North Range at 600. She was running the Black Talon through a post-mission cleaning and calibration, a process that, on this rifle, was more detailed than standard equipment required. Reed had known this since he'd issued the kit and had already set aside the specific cleaning materials she would need. He'd pulled them the night before, had them ready. He waited until she was at a natural pause between stages of the calibration, when the rifle was on the bench and her hands were momentarily still, and then he walked over. She looked up. He set the cleaning materials on the bench beside her. "These are for the suppressor housing on the Black Talon," he said. "The standard kit doesn't have the right solvent for the barrel lining. I should have included them with the original issue." She looked at the materials. "Thank you. I also pulled the cold weather adjustment tools. Same situation, they're specific to this rifle and weren't in the kit." "I noticed," she said. "I improvised. You shouldn't have had to." She looked at him. Reed was not a man who found apologies easy. Not because he lacked integrity, he had plenty, but because he was a man who moved forward, who solved the next problem, who did not by habit dwell on the one he'd already made. It was a quality that made him effective at his job, and not always effective at being the kind of person situations like this required. He made himself stay in the moment. "I handled your request wrong," he said. "Not just the verification process. The whole thing." He paused. "I made a judgment before you finished walking through the door, and everything I did after that was based on the judgment I'd already made, not on what was actually in front of me." Olivia said nothing. "General Carter told me not to make this about my feelings," Reed continued. "He was right. This isn't about my feelings. It's about the fact that you came in with valid authorization, valid qualifications, and a valid request, and you got treated like a joke. And that was mine. Still nothing from her. I can't undo it," he said. "I can make sure it doesn't happen to the next person who walks in here." He paused. "I'm working on the second part." Olivia looked at him for a long moment. "Are you?" she said. It was not skeptical. It was a real question, direct, without accusation, but genuinely inquiring. The question of someone who had seen a version of him that he wouldn't choose to be seen as, and was now assessing whether the version standing in front of her was different or only looked different. "I'm trying to be," he said. She nodded. "Slow. That's honest. I'm trying to be that too." Something moved in her expression, not warmth exactly, not the performance of forgiveness, but something real. The recognition of someone making a genuine effort at a genuinely hard thing. "Use the citation solvent first," she said, turning back to the rifle. "Let it sit for 4 minutes before the brush. The barrel lining is composite, and standard solvent will degrade it over time if you're not careful. He looked at her. She was not looking at him. She was picking up the cleaning kit and beginning to work. He understood what she was doing. She was moving forward. She was giving him the thing he actually needed, which was not absolution but a next step. A way to be useful. A way to be present in a manner that made the conversation about the work, not the wound. "I'll update the maintenance protocol in the armory manual," he said. "Good," she said. He stood for a moment, and then he went back to the armory. He updated the protocol. That afternoon, Lieutenant Colonel Race called Mitchell into her office. She had a document on her desk, not the OC data package, something different. Mitchell saw the classification markings on the edge before she turned it over, and the markings were high enough that he straightened slightly without intending to. "Sit down," Rice said. He sat. "What I'm about to tell you doesn't go past this room until it's officially communicated, which will happen in the next 72 hours. She looked at him. "Understood?" "Yes, ma'am."
General Carter has submitted a commendation package for Captain Hayes.
Full record disclosure, mission documentation, the OC data package as primary evidence. She paused. He's also submitted a recommendation for her to take a role as Shadow Ridge's permanent precision fire coordinator. Not a temporary attachment, a permanent assignment. Mitchell absorbed that. She agreed, he asked. She agreed on one condition. Rice looked at him steadily. She asked that Specialist OC be moved to a primary analyst position. She submitted a written recommendation supporting the transfer, citing the altitude correction discovery and the independent data verification during the mission. He sat very still. Carter approved the transfer before he approved the commendation package, Rice said. "He approved OC's transfer first," he said. "The analyst, who catches a critical error and independently verifies it under operational conditions, is an asset that shouldn't be wasted on support tasks." Reese paused. He said Hayes made a compelling case, which is somewhat understating it. The recommendation letter was 4 paragraphs and cited 3 specific data points from the mission record. Mitchell thought about OC's shaking hands during the debrief, about the 300 light under her door, about the way she'd come to Mitchell first with the deviation data because she'd thought he should see it, since he'd been there. "She doesn't know yet," Rice said, "about the transfer." "Who's going to tell her?" Race looked at him. Hayes asked to do it herself. He nodded. He was not surprised. He was something else, something he didn't have a precise word for, the feeling of watching a person operate at a level where their excellence wasn't just technical but fundamentally human, where the quality of their judgment extended into how they treated the people around them, and what they thought mattered, and what they did about it. He'd spent 2 days trying to understand Olivia Hayes. He thought he might be starting to. Olivia found OC in the data center at 1530. OC was running a terrain analysis for a different operational question, a standard assignment, the kind of work that used her capabilities without coming close to their ceiling. She looked up when Olivia came in, and there was a momentary flash of something in her expression, uncertainty, maybe, or the specific anxiety of someone who has presented findings to senior officers and is still not certain of the full response. "Captain, you have a minute?" "Of course." OC pushed back from the terminal. Olivia sat down across from her. She didn't preamble it. "General Carter is approving a transfer," she said. "Primary analyst, Shadow Ridge operations. Effective next week." OC stared at her. "Your name was submitted," Olivia said. The recommendation cited the altitude error discovery and the post-mission deviation analysis. OC stopped. Started again. "Who submitted it?" "I did." OC looked at her for a long time. Her expression went through several things: surprise, then something more complicated, then the specific emotional recalibration of someone who has been in a place where their work was adequate but not seen, and has just been seen. OC said, "It wasn't ungrateful, it was genuine. The question of someone trying to understand a thing accurately. Because you caught the error in the meteorological model independently, without being asked, and brought it directly to the source rather than going through channels," Olivia said. "That's the instinct that primary analysis requires. You either have it or you don't. You have it. I was 2 days behind you on the altitude correction. You were working from different data and reached the same conclusion. That's verification, not delay. Olivia paused. And the post-mission deviation analysis, you ran that on your own initiative. Nobody asked for it. You looked at the data, saw something that needed explaining, and you explained it. That's exactly the kind of work Shadow Ridge needs in primary. OC looked at the terminal, then back at Olivia. Her jaw was set in the way of someone working to stay composed while something larger than composure is trying to happen. Thank you, she said. Quiet, real. Thank yourself, Olivia said. I wrote what was true. She stood to leave. OC's voice stopped her. The deviation data. The eastern face correction you made in window. She paused. I've run the physics 6 different ways. I can't reconstruct how you accounted for it. Olivia looked at her. I'm not asking you to explain, OC said quickly. I know it's not something you can just explain. I just want you to know that I looked, that I tried to understand it, that I think it's important. Olivia was quiet for a moment. Keep looking, she said finally. Not at my shots specifically. At the physics of in-window correction at extreme range. There's work to be done on the theory. She paused. Good work. The kind that could change how this gets done. OC stared at her. You're telling me to research it, she said. I'm telling you there's a gap in the literature, and you're positioned to address it. Olivia paused. If you want to. OC looked at the terminal, at her data, at the screen that had been showing her a terrain analysis for a question that was not, compared to what she'd just been handed, particularly interesting. Yes, she said. I want to. Then do it right, Olivia said. Document everything. Don't cut corners in the physics to make the conclusion land faster. The conclusion doesn't matter unless the path to it is sound. OC nodded. Olivia walked out. OC turned back to her terminal. She closed the terrain analysis. She opened a new document. She titled it, In-Window Ballistic Correction at Extreme Range, Theoretical Framework. She started writing. The thing nobody had fully anticipated was Okafor. Hector Okafor, who had been in the unit for 3 years, who had opinions about everything and expressed them with a confidence born of being right enough times to have stopped second-guessing himself, who had looked at a request form for the Black Talon and thought he understood what he was looking at. Okafor went through something in the 48 hours after the mission that he couldn't have named, while it was happening and could barely name after. He went over the mission in his head. Standard post-op processing. He did it with every mission systematic review. What worked, what didn't, what he'd do differently. He was honest in this process because he'd learned that dishonesty in post-op review showed up in the next mission as something worse. He reviewed the secondary insertion. Clean. His team had run it well. The transition from staging to advance after the shot had been smooth, communication tight, the containment of the remaining personnel efficient. He was satisfied with his team's performance. Then he reviewed the moment in the briefing room. His question to Torres. His skepticism of the precision element's capability. He had been right to ask. He was still sure of that. Operational responsibility required knowing what you were depending on. But he sat with the difference between the question being right and the framing being right. He'd asked the question through Torres about Olivia, in a room full of people. He'd done it that way, not consciously, not strategically, but because that was the framing that felt natural to him in that context. And the framing had put Olivia in the position of having to justify herself publicly to a room that was already carrying the residue of the armory's laughter. She'd handled it cleanly, better than cleanly, but she'd had to handle it. He found her in the operations room the next morning, updating the Karthos Ridge terrain file with the eastern face wind data, the detail she'd raised in the debrief, the one she'd recommended adding to the model. Can I sit? He asked. She waved at the chair across from her, without looking up. He sat, watched her work for a moment. I've been thinking about the briefing, he said. I know, Olivia said. She kept working. You handled it well. I answered your question. You did, he paused. I'm thinking about the question. The framing. He leaned forward on the table. I asked it in front of the room. I didn't need to do that. I could have come to you directly. Olivia stopped typing. She looked at him. Why didn't you? She asked. Not hostile. Genuinely curious, he thought about it honestly. Because asking in the room put the answer on record in front of everyone. I told myself it was for operational transparency. But he stopped. But it also distributed the doubt, Olivia said. He looked at her. If one person asks a skeptical question privately, it's one person's concern. If the same question gets asked publicly, in front of the whole unit, it becomes the room's question. The doubt gets distributed. She paused. I understand why you did it. I'm not saying it was wrong to want the room's concern addressed. But the way a doubt is expressed shapes how it's heard. And you knew the armory story was already in the room before the brief started. He was quiet. He had known. He hadn't admitted it to himself at the time, but he'd known. The armory story had been in the room, everyone had heard some version of it, and when he'd asked his question through Torres about her, in front of everyone, he'd been adding his weight to something that was already leaning. I didn't intend that, he said. I know you didn't. Does that matter? Olivia looked at him for a moment. Intent matters to the person acting. Impact is what the other person has to work with. A pause. You asked the right operational question. The framing cost me something. Both of those things are true at the same time. Okafor sat with that. It was one of the more honest things anyone had said to him in 3 years of this unit. Not soft, not brutal, just accurate. The kind of accuracy that was more useful than comfort. My team trusts me, he said. I want to make sure I deserve that. You do, Olivia said. They ran clean on this mission. That's yours. She looked at him. What you're asking about is a different thing. Whether you trust yourself to keep getting sharper, not just keep getting results. He stared at her. The answer to that, she said, is to keep asking the honest questions. Even when the honest answer is uncomfortable. He sat back. Thought. Like the one you just asked me, he said. Like the one you just asked yourself, she corrected. I didn't ask you anything. He looked at her. She was right. He'd come here, he'd sat down, he'd opened the question himself, about himself. She'd just answered what he put on the table. Huh, he said. Not profound. Not staged. Just the genuine sound of a man recategorizing something. He stood up. The Eastern Face data, you're updating the terrain model now? Yes. Can I look at it when you're done? She glanced up. You don't have to. My team might be back in this operational area, he said. The wind effect matters for their approach too. A pause. And I want to understand it. Olivia held his gaze for it a moment. Give me 20 minutes. He got coffee and came back. She walked him through the Eastern Face effect, the reflection mechanism, the magnitude variance, the pattern. He asked 4 questions, all of them good ones. She answered them directly, without simplifying. When they were done, he understood it well enough to brief his team. He thanked her and left. She went back to the terrain file. The formal commendation ceremony happened 3 days later. General Carter ran it without ceremony, which was to say, he ran it exactly as formally as the occasion required, and not a degree more. The unit was assembled. The documentation was read into the record. Olivia stood at attention, the front of the room, and received the commendation with the same expression she'd worn in the armory on the first morning, controlled, present, entirely without performance. Carter pinned the commendation and stepped back. He said, Captain Hayes, this unit has seen a great many talented operators come through it. I want to say clearly in front of this room that what you demonstrated at Karthos Ridge is not in the category of talent. Talent is a starting point. What you brought to this mission was the product of years of work that most of the people in this room don't have the clearance to know about, applied under conditions that would have ended a different mission. He paused. This unit is better for having you in it. The room was quiet. Then Okafor started clapping. He was not a man who started the applause. He was not a man who made public gestures. But he started it, and the room followed without hesitation, and the sound of it filled the space with something that was not performed and not required, and was therefore, precisely, the right thing. Olivia stood at attention. She did not smile, she did not tear up. She stood straight and looked at Carter and accepted it the way she accepted everything. The way she'd accepted the standard issue rifle, the way she'd accepted Reed's apology, and Okafor's honest question, and OC's deviation data. Completely. Without theater. Without making it about herself. When the applause stopped, Carter said, dismissed. People filed out. The group separated into its natural smaller conversations, Okafor to his team, Torres to the senior officers, Rice to the exit, with the specific efficiency of a woman who has already processed the emotion of the moment and moved on to its administrative implications. Reed waited by the door. When Olivia reached him, he stood aside to let her pass. She paused. The maintenance protocol update, she said. Did you add the suppressor housing procedure? He looked at her. Yes. Yesterday morning, she nodded. Good, she started to walk. Then Reed, he stopped. You said you were working on it, she said. The second part. He understood what she was referring to. Making sure it didn't happen to the next person who walked in the door. Yes, he said. Don't stop, she said simply. She walked out. He stood there. Don't stop. Not I forgive you. Not it's okay. Not the thing that would have made it about the past and sealed it away. The thing that pointed forward. The thing that made it ongoing rather than resolved. The thing that required more of him than Absolutius ever could. He stood there for a moment. Then he went back to work. That evening, Mitchell was alone in the operations room when Olivia came in. She set the Black Talon case on the table and sat down across from him with the specific weight of someone who has been operating at high intensity for an extended period and has finally, in the quiet of a room with no audience, allowed themselves to simply be tired. He looked at her. You okay? He asked. She considered the question. Yes. That's not a real answer. She looked at him. Something shifted barely but real. The specific softening of a person who has been carrying the professional exterior for a long time and has found themselves in a room where it's not required. I'm tired, she said, genuinely tired, not the physical kind. He understood that. The other kind of tired, the kind that comes from operating in a sustained state of being underestimated, of having to be twice as certain before you speak, of reading every room before you allow yourself to change it. How long have you been doing it? He asked. She knew what he meant. Since the beginning, she said. Since I was the first woman to go through the Black Talon program evaluation. Since my record was sealed because the operations I ran couldn't be acknowledged. Since every posting where the first thing anyone saw was not the work but the category. He said nothing. The silence is the choice you make, she said. Because the alternative is spending your energy on the argument instead of the work. And the argument doesn't move things forward. The work does. She paused. Sometimes, he said. Not always. She looked at the Black Talon case. Sometimes the work is exactly right and the room still doesn't change. You just learn to carry it. He looked at her. This room changed, he said. She met his eyes. This room changed, she agreed. She picked up the Black Talon case and stood. Get some sleep, Mitchell. Will you? She paused at the door. Tonight, she said yes. She walked out. He sat alone in the operations room and thought about what she'd carried. Not the rifle. The other thing. The weight of a record that couldn't be seen, a history that couldn't be cited, a level of capability that had to stay silent until a situation forced it to be visible, and even then, had to be visible through performance rather than testimony, through outcome rather than claim. He thought about the armory, about how easy it had been for the room to laugh, about how much it cost the person who had to stand there and absorb it because fighting it was not the efficient use of the energy she needed for the work. He thought about all the rooms he'd been in, all the people he'd been around, all the moments he'd assessed someone quickly and moved on. He thought about how many things he'd missed. The operations room was quiet. Outside, somewhere across the base, the wind was moving through the empty North Range, crossing the open ground the way wind did in Nevada, without purpose, without direction, going wherever it went. He sat there. He had a lot of things to learn. He was going to start tomorrow. 3 weeks after Karthos Ridge, Fort Raven went back to its regular rhythm. That was the thing about operational bases, they didn't pause to absorb what had happened. The mission closed, the paperwork processed, the next set of requirements arrived. And the machinery of it all moved forward with the particular indifference of institutions that are too large and too busy to stop and mark every significant thing that passes through them. People who had never been on the mission still walked the same corridors, ate in the same hall, processed the same paperwork they'd been processing before the Black Talon case had ever come through the armory door. But underneath the regular rhythm, something had shifted. Mitchell felt it most clearly in the operations room. The way people brought information to Olivia was now not with the hesitance of someone approaching a senior officer in a new unit, but with the directness of people who had recalibrated what they were looking at and were now working with what was actually there. Okafor's team ran their secondary planning past her before they finalized it. Torres referenced her wind analysis in the updated Karthos Ridge terrain file during the regional planning session. Riss, who had always been careful and correct in every professional interaction, added a quality to her interactions with Olivia that Mitchell could only describe as ease. The someone no longer needed to manage a gap between what they knew and what the room acknowledged. The gap had closed. Not completely, not without the residue that these things always leave, but closed enough that the room functioned differently, and the difference was real. OC felt it too, in a more personal way. Her transfer to primary analyst had been effective for 6 days when she ran her first independent briefing for the Shadow Ridge planning team. It was a standard intelligence assessment, threat disposition, movement patterns, communications intercept analysis for a potential follow-on operation in the same regional corridor as Karthos Ridge. She had prepared it with the thoroughness of someone who understood that the first independent briefing set the tone for every briefing that followed, and she had spent 3 nights on it. Torres ran the meeting. Carter attended. Okafor was there with 2 members of his secondary team. OA stood at the front of the room and presented for 22 minutes without notes. When she finished, Carter asked 2 questions. Both were the kind of questions that are actually confirmations dressed as inquiries. The questions a senior officer asks when the briefing has been thorough enough that what remains is refinement, not correction. She answered both cleanly. Torres said, "Good brief, specialist." It was not effusive. It was not the kind of praise that embarrasses a room. It was the specific, professional acknowledgement that means, you did your job at the level this room requires, and that is what is expected, and it is enough. OC walked out of that room with the particular straightness of someone whose back has just been released from a weight they'd been carrying, so long they'd forgotten it was there. She went directly to the data center and pulled up the document she'd titled, In-Window Ballistic Correction at Extreme Range, Theoretical Framework. She'd been building it for 3 weeks. It was 14 pages. It needed to be longer. She sat down and kept writing. Reed made a change to the armory intake process. He didn't announce it. He didn't send a memorandum explaining the philosophical reasoning. He simply changed it a modification to the verification protocol that required every authorization document above a certain classification level to be processed immediately and confidentially, without the request form being displayed or discussed with personnel not directly involved in the verification. It took him 40 minutes to draft, route, and implement. He also added a standing requirement for himself. When any equipment request was outside his immediate recognition, any designation he didn't know, any program he hadn't seen, he would verify first and assess later. Not assess and then verify. The order mattered. The order was the whole thing. He told no one about the change as a personal statement. When Cho noticed the updated protocol and asked about it, Reed said simply, "Better procedure." Cho looked at him for a moment. "Does this have anything to do with the Hayes situation?" Reed looked back at him. "It has to do with doing the job right." He paused. "Those aren't different things." Cho nodded and went back to his terminal. Reed went back to the inventory. He thought about what Olivia had said, "Don't stop." He didn't intend to. The second twist came on a Tuesday morning, 4 weeks after the mission. Mitchell was in the operations room when General Carter called him in. He went in, expecting a routine assignment review. Carter ran these periodically, and Mitchell was due for one. He sat down across the desk and waited. Carter looked at him for a moment before speaking. He had the expression he wore when what he was about to say required more precision than most conversations. "I want to talk to you about your next assignment," Carter said. "Sir, Shadow Ridge is expanding its precision fire coordination program. Captain Hayes is taking the coordinator role permanently. As part of that expansion, she'll need a dedicated security element lead." Carter paused. "Not general unit support. A permanent dedicated pairing." Mitchell kept his expression even. "I understand." "She asked for you specifically," Carter said. Mitchell sat very still. "She gave me a written rationale," Carter continued, "which I read. The specific language she used was," he picked up a page from his desk. "She said, Mitchell asks the right questions, and he asks them early enough for the answers to be useful. That is the quality a security element lead for this role requires above all others." Carter set the page down. "She also said you stayed still when it mattered. On the overlook. When the patrol was moving and the window was open." He paused. "She said most people can't do that." Mitchell looked at the desk. He thought about the overlook, about the patrol sounds moving closer, about the precise quality of not moving, not transmitting, holding everything still and trusting the person beside him to do what she'd come there to do. He'd thought of it as simply following instruction, doing what the situation required. He hadn't thought of it as a skill. "I'd take the assignment," he said. "I know you would," Carter said. "I'm not asking if you'll take it. I'm telling you it's been approved, and asking you to understand what it means." "What does it mean, sir?" Carter looked at him steadily. "It means you're going to be alongside someone who operates at a level that will consistently exceed what you're used to benchmarking against. You'll see things you can't fully explain. You'll be in rooms where what she carries is still invisible to most people, and your job will be to make sure nothing interferes with the work, not operationally, not institutionally, not interpersonally." He paused. "That last part is harder than it sounds. The interpersonal part. The part where you're the person in the room who knows what's actually there, and the room doesn't, and you have to decide every time how to bridge that. Carter paused. "She doesn't need you to fight her battles. She's not looking for a defender. She's looking for someone who stays present, stays accurate, and stays useful." He looked at Mitchell directly. "Can you do that?" Mitchell thought about it. "Not quickly." "Honestly, I can try to," he said. Carter nodded. "That's the right answer." He paused. "The wrong answer is yes without the qualifier." Mitchell almost smiled. "Almost. Report to Hayes at 800 tomorrow," Carter said. "She's beginning the pre-planning cycle for the follow-on operation in the Karthos corridor." "Yes, sir." He stood to leave. "Mitchell," he stopped. "What she said about you asking the right questions." Carter looked at him. "She's not wrong. But I'll tell you what she didn't put in the written rationale." Mitchell waited. "The day she arrived, in that armory you watched. You didn't laugh. And you didn't perform not laughing, which is its own kind of failure." Carter held his gaze. "You just watched and paid attention. That's rarer than it should be." Mitchell stood there. "Dismissed," Carter said. He walked out into the corridor and stopped. He stood there thinking about what Carter had just told him, that the most significant thing he'd done in the first 5 minutes of knowing Olivia Hayes was simply to not follow the room's lead. To watch instead of perform. To hold his assessment open instead of closing it. It had not felt like a significant choice in the moment. It had felt like nothing, just the natural response of someone who wasn't sure yet and wasn't ready to act on uncertainty. He had not known, standing in that armory, that he was being read, that the assessment was mutual, that the room's behavior was information she was gathering, and his behavior was part of what she was gathering. He started walking. He had a lot to learn. He was going to start in the morning. He found Olivia that evening in the North Range, not working. That was the first thing he noticed. She wasn't running calculations, or calibrating the Black Talon, or logging wind readings. She was sitting on the bench with her hands around a thermos, looking at the open range in the specific way of someone who is not thinking about any one thing in particular, but letting the weight of several things settle. He sat down across from her. She handed him the thermos without comment. He poured a cup and handed it back. They sat like that for a while. Carter told me, he said. I know. You asked for me specifically. Yes. He looked at the range. Why did you write it down? The rationale. You could have just told him. She was quiet for a moment. Because verbal recommendations disappear, she said. Someone says a name, attaches a reason, it gets processed and filed without the reasoning. Written, it becomes part of the record. She paused. You deserve to be in the record accurately. He looked at her. You think I need that, he said. Not defensive, just understanding. Everyone needs accurate documentation of why they're where they are, she said. Especially people who are there for the right reasons. The record matters, especially when the room changes and the people who saw it don't all stay. He sat with that. The room changes. People move, rotate out, transfer. The institutional memory of why a decision was made degrades fast. What remains is paperwork, and if the paperwork is accurate, the reasoning survives. She was protecting the reasoning, not just for him. As a principle, the OC recommendation, he said. Same thing, she confirmed. He looked at the open range. How long are you going to be here, he asked. At Fort Raven. As long as the work requires, she said. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have. She looked at him sideways. I don't plan in the way you're asking about. I know what the next operation requires, and I work toward it. After that, I'll know what the one after requires. Doesn't that get lonely? The question came out before he'd fully decided to ask it, and he braced slightly for the kind of deflection that people use when a question gets too close to something they don't put in front of others. But she didn't deflect. She thought about it. Sometimes, she said. The work takes up most of it. The rest, she paused. The rest you learn to carry differently than you used to. He understood. The differently being the important word, not away, not resolved, but reconfigured into something that didn't interfere with the next thing. Okafor asked me yesterday if you were staying, Mitchell said. He phrased it as an operational question, whether the precision fire coordinator role was a permanent function or a mission-specific attachment. What did you tell him? I told him I didn't know. He paused. He said, I hope she stays. Then he went back to his planning. Didn't say anything else about it. Olivia looked at the range. Okafor doesn't say things he doesn't mean, she said. No, he doesn't. She was quiet. He looked at her. There was something in her expression right now that he hadn't seen before, not the controlled professional exterior, not the deep internal processing, not the directness she used when she was giving someone information they needed. Something quieter. The expression of someone who has spent a long time operating in rooms that don't fully see them, and is now sitting in the specific, unusual experience of being somewhere that does. It wasn't comfortable for her, he realized. Not because it was bad. Because it was unfamiliar. The thing you've wanted for a long time and then don't fully know what to do with when it arrives. He didn't say any of that. He just sat there with her in the quiet of the North Range and let the evening do what evenings do, hold things without requiring them to be resolved. After a while she stood. Get some sleep, she said. You too. She picked up her thermos and paused. Mitchell. Yeah. Thank you for staying still on the overlook, she said. I know what that cost you. He looked at her. It didn't cost me much. It costs more than you think, she said. When everything in you wants to move and you hold still anyway. That's not nothing. She paused. It's one of the harder things. She walked off the range. He sat there for a moment longer in the dark, thinking about staying still. About how it could be the most active choice in a situation, the choice that required the most while looking the outs like nothing at all. He thought about the armory, about watching instead of laughing, which had also looked like nothing and turned out to be the thing she remembered. He thought that the most important choices he'd made in the last month had all looked, from the outside, like absence of action. He got up and went inside. The follow-on operation briefing happened 10 days later. A different room, a different mission, a different set of parameters, but the same unit, mostly. Some faces had changed. 2 of Okafor's team had rotated to different assignments, replaced by 2 new operators who were good and knew it and were still learning what this unit's version of good looked like. Osi was at the front as primary analyst, for the first time in a full unit briefing, running the intelligence assessment with the focused clarity of someone who has done the work and stands behind it completely. She was different, not louder, not more polished, different in the way that people are different when the room they're standing in has decided to take them seriously. She moved through the data without the hesitance that had marked her first briefings. She fielded Carter's questions directly. When Okafor raised a concern about the movement pattern data, she acknowledged the gap, explained what she knew and what she didn't, and offered a specific plan for addressing it before the mission window. Okafor nodded. That works. No performance. Just an operational conversation between 2 people who respected each other's function. Mitchell sat in the back and watched and thought that 3 weeks ago this exact exchange would have looked different. Osei would have been more careful, more defensive, hedging in ways that protected her from being wrong rather than positioning her to be most useful. The difference wasn't the information she had. It was what the room had told her she was. He looked at Olivia. She was at the table, reviewing the terrain documentation for the new operational area, making precise annotations in pencil that she would later incorporate into the updated mission file. She was not performing attentiveness. She was just attending fully, without reservation, the way she did everything. She looked up and caught his eye across the room. He held her gaze for a moment. She went back to the terrain documentation. He thought, this is what it looks like when a room functions correctly. Not perfectly. There was no perfectly, but correctly. When the people in it are seen with enough accuracy that their actual capabilities can be used, and the gaps between perception and reality are small enough to work within. It had taken a request form and a moment of laughter and 48 hours of wind data, and one shot from 2,100 meters and 3 weeks of people sitting with what they'd seen and deciding what to do with it. It had taken a woman who chose silence over argument because she understood that the argument doesn't move things forward and the work does. It had taken people who were honest enough to look at themselves, read Okafor Mitchell himself, and decide that what they found was not fixed. That was the whole story. That was all of it. Not a lesson handed down from above. Not a moment of dramatic revelation that changed everything at once. Just people, in a room, choosing over and over to look more carefully than they had before. 2 months after Karthos Ridge, Osi submitted the first draft of her theoretical framework paper to Carter for review. It was 41 pages. It was dense, technically rigorous, and grounded in the mission data, with a precision that made it more than academic. It was applicable. It described, in physical and mathematical terms, a theory of in-window ballistic correction at extreme range that had not existed in the literature before, because no one had thought to look for it where Osi had looked. Not in the shooter's mechanics, not in the physics of the projectile, but in the integration between the two. In the specific cognitive physical loop that occurred in the final fraction of a second before a round left the barrel, and how that loop could, under specific conditions and in specific people, incorporate sensory information faster than deliberate conscious processing. It was, Carter told Torres after reading it, remarkable. Torres told Mitchell. Mitchell went to find Osi. She was in the data center. She looked up when he came in. Carter read the paper, he said. She straightened slightly. And, he said, remarkable. She was quiet. Remarkable, she said again, as if she was testing whether the word was real. His word. She looked at the screen, at the document. At 41 pages that had begun as a question, she couldn't stop asking about a shot. She couldn't stop thinking about. Does Hayes know, she asked. Not yet. I came to you first. Osi looked at him. Tell her before anyone else, she said. It's her shot. The paper exists because she told me to keep looking. Mitchell looked at her. You wrote it, he said. She created the data, Osi said. And she pointed at the gap and told me it was worth filling. She paused. We both know which part mattered more. They both mattered, Mitchell said. Equally. Osi considered that. Okay, she said finally. Equally, she almost smiled. But tell her first. He found Olivia in the Precision Fire Coordination Office, a proper office now, not the simulation bay, a designated space that had appeared in the base's room assignment chart without fanfare, but with the weight of permanence. She was running projections for the follow-on operation, building the pre-mission thermal analysis that she would use to construct the pre-window calculation framework. She did not look up when Mitchell came in. Osi's paper, he said. Carter called it remarkable. Olivia's hand stilled on the keyboard. She didn't turn immediately. She sat with it for a moment, the specific way she sat with things, not performing a reaction, but actually processing. Then she turned. Is it ready for external submission? She asked. Carter's reviewing for classification. When it clears, it should go to the Precision Fire Academic Review Board, she said. And a copy to the Program Documentation Archive. With Osi's name as primary author and a full methodology citation. She paused. Make sure the Karthos Ridge mission data is properly attributed. The paper is only as strong as the data it's built on. I'll tell her. Tell her something else too, Olivia said. What? Tell her this is the first one. She held his gaze. There's more. The framework she built opens questions that need answering. This paper solves one problem and creates 12. She paused. That's exactly what good work is supposed to do. He went back and told Osi both things. Osi sat with the second one for a long time. Then she opened a new document and started writing. The night before the follow-on operation insertion, Mitchell found Reed in the armory. It was late past 2100 and Reed was doing what Mitchell had come to understand Reed did when he needed to think. He worked. Methodical, physical, organized work that kept his hands busy and his mind clear. He was running inventory, not because the inventory needed running at this hour. Because the inventory was always there and always honest. Mitchell leaned against the doorframe. You ready for tomorrow? Mitchell asked. Reed looked up. My job's here. Yours is out there. I know. Just checking. Reed set down the clipboard. How's she doing? Pre-mission. Same as last time, Mitchell said. Which is to say, you wouldn't know she was pre-mission unless you knew what to look for. Reed nodded. He seemed to be deciding something. I've been thinking about something, Reed said. Since the commendation ceremony, he paused. When Carter stood up in front of the room and said what he said about her record, being things most people in the building don't have clearance to know, I thought about all the times she walked past this armory, and I didn't know any of it. All the times someone like her walks past and I'm processing them, based on what I can see. Mitchell said nothing. The protocol change helps, Reed said. The procedural stuff. But that's not the part that keeps me up. He paused. The part that keeps me up is the question of how many times I got it wrong, without a general being in the hallway to tell me later. He looked at Mitchell. You understand what I mean? Yeah, Mitchell said. I do. How do you work on that? Reed asked. The part that's not procedure. The part that's just how you look at someone. Mitchell thought about it seriously. I don't know if there's a clean answer, he said finally. I think you just keep asking the question. Keep noticing when you've pre-answered something. Keep going back and looking again. He paused. She told me once that the most important thing she got from the armory that morning wasn't the standard issue rifle. It was information about the room. Reed stared at him. She was reading us, Reed said, while we were performing at her. Yes. Reed was quiet for a long time. That's a hell of a way to have to move through the world, he said. Yes, Mitchell said, it is. Reed picked up his clipboard. He stood there for a moment. Tell her good luck tomorrow. From me. She doesn't need it, Mitchell said. But I'll tell her. He walked back toward the Precision Fire Coordination Office. He thought about what Reed had said, a hell of a way to have to move through the world. He thought about what it cost the continuous reading of rooms before you changed them. The choosing of silence over argument, not because the argument was wrong but because the work was more important. The carrying of a record that couldn't be cited, and a history that couldn't be spoken, and a capability that had to prove itself over and over in rooms that started from doubt. He thought about Olivia sitting on the North Range in the dark with a thermos, saying, "Sometimes. The rest you learn to carry differently." He stopped in the corridor. He understood finally and completely why she had said learn rather than manage. Manage implied control, keeping something contained, preventing it from affecting what mattered. Learn implied incorporation, taking it in, understanding it, letting it become part of how you moved forward, rather than a weight that resisted forward motion. She had learned it, over years, in rooms that didn't see her, in operations that couldn't be acknowledged. In an armory at Fort Raven on a Tuesday morning, when a man held up a request form and a room laughed and she stood there and absorbed it and filed it and walked out with a standard issue rifle to go do the work. She had learned all of it, and she was still here. He knocked on the Precision Fire Coordination Office door at 2200. She was still working. "Reed says good luck," Mitchell said. She looked up. Something in her expression brief, real, unguarded. "Tell him thank you." "I will," he paused. "How are the thermals looking for tomorrow?" "Better than Karthos Ridge," she said. "The cycle is longer. The variance is smaller, more predictable." She paused. "Which means I'll spend the night wondering what I'm not accounting for." "That's reassuring." "It should be," she said. "The moment I stop wondering is the moment I start missing things." He looked at her. She was the same person who had stood in that armory. The same controlled exterior, the same precision, the same complete absence of need for the room's approval. But he saw her differently, now not because she had changed, but because he had accumulated enough context to read what was actually there. The deliberate silence, the patience, the willingness to absorb what a room was before she changed it. The instinct, at every turn, to make the work about the work rather than about herself. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't performance. It was who she was, built from years of choosing what mattered over what was easier. "I'll see you at 430, he said. 430, she confirmed. He turned to go. "Mitchell." He stopped. "That first morning," she said. "In the armory, you stayed." She held his gaze. "You stayed present, and you stayed honest, and you didn't perform either one. That's why we're here." He stood in the doorway. He didn't say anything. Because there wasn't anything to say that would add to it. He nodded once. He walked back to the barracks and lay down in the dark and breathed. Outside, across the base, the North Range was empty and still, and the Nevada night was doing what it always did, moving slowly toward morning. In the Precision Fire Coordination Office, the light was on until 130. Then it went off. And in the morning, Olivia Hayes picked up the Black Talon and walked toward the next thing the way she had always walked toward everything, without announcement, without audience, without any need for the world to watch. Because the work didn't require the world to watch. It only required her to be ready, and she always was.